welcome to another edition of Res Forum Live. My name is John Devitt and I will be your host for the next 75 minutes or so of live video interaction, bringing together the very best opinions, research and the best insights in the world of global mobility today. We have just over 100 people from all around the world registered to join us today. And for those of you who've been a part of Res Forum Live in the past, you'll know that our aim is to have as much participation as possible. So from here in our control room in just outside Oxford in the United Kingdom, I'll be guiding you through the panel discussions, the breakout sessions, and the various presentations. We'll be taking the temperature with opinion polls, and if you have any comments, just leave them in chat, which appears on the Zoom call, and I will attempt to bring those in at the relevant moment and introduce those into the debates as we go through. Now, the theme of today's Res Forum Live is to examine the practical implementation of the various policies that we've had to adopt given the nature of the COVID-19 pandemic. And, of course, now that for many of us, not all of us, of course, are beginning to see those restrictions being lifted. So to put that into some sort of context, we're joined first of all by David Schofield. David Schofield is the Res Forum strategic advisor, and he joins us to set out how we're going to take this forward, some ammunition for us to add into the debate. He joins us from central London. David, a little bit of context then in what we will be talking about today.
Sure. Thank you, John, and hello from London to everyone around the world. It's a great pleasure to be back on Res Forum Live Edition 3. As John has said, today's event is all about how to put the new GM model into practice. So we at the Res Forum have been working with our Strategic Advisory Board members, our technical partners, and our academic advisors to help to define and to understand that model. So we at Res Forum see the new GM model as taking shape against the background of a wider trend towards decentralization and flexibility, which was already visible in recent years, but has been made more acute by the current crisis. We see this trend as highlighting the challenges of applying a 21st century post-crisis approach to what are, let's face it, 20th century nation states. That's the environment we're working in. In responding to these challenges, the rapidly developing new GM model must, we believe, include a number of key elements. And here we can see them now, and I'm going to talk to these very briefly. Firstly, flexibility of GM programs. As organizations look at a range of international assignments, virtual working, and business travel. Secondly, flexibility of location, because cross-border so-called working from home in alternative locations has proven to be a major issue for businesses. This has arisen either because of displacement when lockdowns started, or as a matter of preference and meeting family concerns. So organizations now have to look at mobility of work as well as mobility of people. Given this greater flexibility, our industry has to address real practical concerns around compliance, tax, work permits, visas, permanent establishment, and so on. And certainly organizations are having to concentrate much more on duty of care towards their international assignees. Businesses, of course, do need to focus now particularly on the identification and management of strategic risks. And these are the kind of risks that pose existential threats to organizations. For example, at the moment, the current collapse of air travel is affecting airlines and hence aircraft manufacturers around the world. So employers like Airbus are already talking about making a large number of their international employees redundant. We also want to focus or need to focus on operational risks. And these are the kind of things that affect day-to-day business activities. And our technical partners from Anvil Group will be talking about that in a bit more detail later on in today's event. We, of course, need to develop a more compelling employee value proposition, I think, to what is an increasingly diverse global workforce. And that issue of diversity is becoming so much more important these days. The crisis Also highlights, I think, the need to review any organization's global mobility strategy. What is your business trying to achieve through its global mobility program? But the crisis is also, we think, giving an opportunity to GM leaders to take a higher profile in contributing to business decisions and to advising company leadership. Our colleagues are telling us that they're having to look quite actively at new reward models, quite radically so, for example, which will reward individuals around the world in relation to the value of their contribution, rather than old-fashioned company-based, country-based, I beg your pardon, pay scales. There are certainly calls out there that we're hearing in the RES Forum for a more sustainable and responsible approach to global mobility post-COVID-19, a trend that was always there, hastened along by the current situation. In fact, this precise subject is going to be at the heart of a new RES Forum research paper produced in conjunction with our technical partners, Harmony, Server, and INEO, and that'll be available very soon. More information on that shortly. Of course, connected global mobility, as we discussed on the last RES Forum Live, is very important indeed in terms of how technology can practically support the new GM agenda. And we'll be returning to that subject, I'm sure. And last but not least, organizations have to balance the desire from assignees for flexibility and to achieve their personal and career development objectives with the objectives of the business. Let's not forget, businesses need to be profitable and need to meet the needs of their clients. So it's a matter of balancing business and assignee objectives. John, that is somewhat of a whistle-stop tour through the elements that we see at the RES Forum being defining the new GM model. And we're sure that this session today will help us to flesh out that even more and to give us a better handle on what the GM model would look like in practice. So thank you, John.
Thank you, David. That's extremely interesting and a lot of ammunition for us to introduce into the debate as we go through, bearing in mind, of course, that our aim is to allow as much participation as possible. So just in that vein, I shall start off this section of RES Forum Live with a bit of participation that we can all join in with. And that is our first poll. We're going to bring in a poll to begin with to test the mood, to see what you all think. The poll that will come up on the screen now is really looking at the sort of short to medium term, what we think represents the likely future shape of GM programs over the next 12 to 18 months. Now, you've got a chance to put in one of four choices there. So if you put in what you think, and then we'll let it do its thing, and we'll bring it back up again as soon as it has done its thing, and as soon as you've had the chance to do it. And we'll then make a bit of a comparison with the result to see how it was when we actually did this about just over a month ago on the last RES Forum Live. So let's have a look at the result, if it's ready, or if it's not, we'll delay it for a little bit and bring it in perhaps. There we go, there it is. Now, I can tell you, you can clearly see that the main one that's won there is that there's going to be somewhat changed model with fewer assignments, but a greater focus on a fit-for-purpose, business-driven assignments. That's come out with 78%, which is precisely the same as it was last time we did this. The only thing that's gone up slightly there is the first choice, the eventual return to broadly pre-crisis size and mix of programs, which has gone from 9 to 13%. Other, you'll be delighted to hear, has completely disappeared this time, which suggests that we are at least getting our questions better than perhaps we were before, or at least maybe you're changing your views. But let's move on and bring in our first panelists, because we're going to start off talking to our corporate leaders, and we've got with us Bill Baker from Cox Enterprises, Emery Castaneda, and David Rooney from EY. Emery is from Unilever in the Philippines. Thank you all for joining us. Before I bring you in, though, I'm going to talk to Ben Bader, who is one of the academics who does a lot of work with Res Forum. He's well known to anybody who's been involved in Res Forum in the past. And Ben, you've been doing quite a lot of research, including a report that is available on Res Forum's website at the moment called Now, Next and Beyond. And tell me, what did that report tell us about the expected changes and the greater flexibility in terms of the types of mobility that we're likely to see in the future?
Thanks, John. Yeah, welcome from Newcastle. And as I said, the report is available. So just a brief summary. So basically, looking at the beyond, one of the key things we identified is that there is going to be a decline in long-term assignments. By the time we did the survey, it was actually more than half of the companies saying that at least a moderate to a very high decrease in LTAs will be visible. They also forecast a big decrease in international business travel and short-term assignments. And not surprisingly, more than 80% of the companies responding said there's going to be a lot more virtual work. Now, what I'd be really interested in seeing how this continues is what's going to remain from this now that we are more into that. In particular, looking at virtual work, for most people I've been talking to, virtual work is mainly Zoom or MS Teams or whatever, so video conferencing. But there's actually a lot more to that, and I'd be really interested in experiencing and seeing how in the future the use of real virtual work is going to develop, because at least in terms of Zoom and video calls, I think we're seeing somewhat of a inverted U-shaped curve. So in the beginning, people just started picking up. There was a big excitement, and at some later point, it was dropping. So Zoom fatigue, people not so excited about that anymore. So I think that's going to be a change where we don't know where it's going, but it's going to be very interesting. And the other part of the question, the types of mobility. So I personally do think, and I believe the poll this time and last time reflects this, there's going to be some sort of normal global mobility again, but the types of assignment will change. So there's always going to be some sort of developmental assignment. You send people out in the world together, intercultural experience, leadership experience, and so on. So that may even go back to normal, maybe even increase. But technical assignments and knowledge sharing assignments, the trend is probably that these kinds of assignments will either completely vanish or at least decline in importance a lot, especially what kind of knowledge you can share within the organization across the globe using digital technologies. Has just experienced a tremendous boost, and so COVID is a catalyst in that sense.
Okay, Ben, we're already running rather over time, so I'm going to, apologies already for trying to keep people short, but David Rooney, if I can bring you up straight away now. David, I think that one of the things that we've been hearing about a lot is of course the amount of flexibility that people are going to be bringing into their programs as a matter of necessity. How do you see that?
Yeah, there's not a client meeting goes by without mentioning the word flexibility. So maybe 4 points and a recommendation. So I think the first point to notice is flexibility was going on before COVID. So all of us were speaking to our clients about the need for core flex policies, which was very much driven by employee experience. So we were seeing already flexibility being built into mobility types. I think where we are going to go is that we're going to see flexibility across mobility types. This is my second point. So I call these hybrid or fusion assignments. There's a lot of hype in the market about virtual assignments. I think that is a part solution, not a whole solution. I think what we're going to see is a combination of assignment plus business travel plus virtual. So for example, the assignee goes to the host country for a number of months to basically understand the scope of their role, meet their team, get started, They return home, they work virtually with the team, they business trip as necessary, and then at the end they return to the host country to close out. So that is an example of flexibility across mobility types, or a kind of hybrid approach. I'm not going to go into the detail. Everyone thinks virtual is really easy. Virtual is not really easy. Writing the policy is really easy, but there are a plethora of compliance issues attached to them.
Okay.
So flexibility across mobility. Mm-hmm.
No, thank you very much, David. I mean, I don't know if there's anything you want to add very quickly to that, or...
Yeah, I think just maybe two things. Also, flexibility in terms of scope. So we're seeing the scope of mobility teams changing. So a lot of our inquiries at the minute are really about cross-border working, people stuck in one location, even linked to talent acquisition. So the scope of mobility teams is changing. So maybe we need to rebrand away from global mobility and towards something like international cross-border advisory.
Thank you very much indeed, David. I'm going to bring in Emery Castaneda now all the way from the Philippines. Thank you. It's very late with you. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for staying up so late to be with us today. And it's great to have a view from Asia. In a sense, you're a bit ahead of us, I guess, in Western Europe, the United States, and in fact, everywhere else. What sort of practical? You're the global mobility leader with Unilever in the Philippines, so a massive multinational company. What sort of things are you practically seeing? Because presumably you are putting things into practice now.
Exactly, and it's very unnerving actually, because when it all happened, it started with my region, the region I support, and in China at that, where we have a lot of assignees, but in terms of practical activities, we practically did assignee tracking, compliance management, visa, immigration for those people who were stuck in different locations. Because remember, that thing happened during the Chinese New Year celebration, and most of my assignees in the region are on holidays in different countries. So these activities were probably the only things that we did for the months of March to May during the crisis management mode.
And how have things changed now then?
Now it's like recovery mode for us. Now that everybody has probably, some of them have not returned yet, but in terms of we get a better handle on things already. We know, kind of it now that it has also, we had similar experiences in other regions. So our leadership team, my counterparts in other regions, we usually just have weekly meetings. Now we have daily stand-up meetings, and that's how we learn new things, because we haven't encountered anything like this in our lifetime. So we learn as we go. So eventually we realized that we needed to operationalize tracking of assignees using our data management tools, and true enough, eventually that data is now being used by our top level leadership teams. So we recorded people who are not at the host country, since when, and with whom, if they are with their families, because there could be tax implications for those extended working in different locations, especially those not in their home country. And they could be tippings, tax residencies, especially in areas where it's very tax savvy. Probably in the COVID situation, tax authorities are very forgiving and lenient, but they will soon, I'm sure, run after those employees who are working outside and tipping some tax residency durations. We also needed to identify immigration implications, because some of them might not be citizens of the country where they are stuck in, and they have probably, some of them have expiring visas in their host country. So good thing this is a not a good thing, but at least this is a global phenomenon. Not just tax authorities, but also immigration authorities are kind of forgiving in that aspect. And as we learn as we go, and we work from there, and now we're actually planning for the thriving mode after recovery. What do we do now?
Emery, thank you very much indeed. And our final panelist here on the corporate section is Bill Baker, who is Director of Relocation with Cox Enterprises, and joins us from what looks like a rather nice country setting in North Carolina. And I know that, Bill, you have an interesting take on what might be described as a mobility of work, don't you?
Yes, well, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I work with a company that's primarily based in media communications and automotive businesses. I would say we're primarily, and have been primarily domestic in terms of our mobility activity, but we certainly have candidates who are outside our borders. And the points that David touched on certainly, apply on both sides for us domestically as well as internationally. The 3 points that I think stood out to me are the employee value proposition. That's, I think, key for us as a company. 122-year-old company that has always focused on employees, and it continues to be the focus of the company. The people are what make us special and unique, and they are what make the businesses move and certainly make them successful. And the second part of that is flexibility of location, and then thirdly is technology. Of course, compliance presses against all of that.
And Bill, I think you had a specific example of where you saw somebody using the
For those of you, if you'll focus on John's image there, about a week ago on a Sunday morning, I had an opportunity to meet somebody here in Franklin, North Carolina. We're a community of 4,000 people. I live here and I work full time. Atlanta's about 120 miles from me, and that's where our corporate headquarters are. But I was in town and I happened to strike up a conversation with a gentleman who was on that Harley. And you'll see the 2 backpacks that are strapped to that rider, the passenger seat on his Harley. One of those 2 backpacks was his office. And I think if ever there was a good image, picture representing 1,000 words to illustrate what will be flexibility, in some ways could be the new norm once we return to work, I think that's a pretty good image. The person that I met actually works for the U.S. Department of Defense, and he is working as a contractor, but is involved in recruiting and a variety of other things. So we had an interesting conversation. I asked him about that, about his work, and as he was describing to me, and I saw the bike, that's why I took a picture of it, because it struck me as we, in the current role we're in, as we return to work, whether it's on, inside a country, or whether it's interregion, or for us interstate.
Okay, Bill, I apologize. I'm gonna have to cut you short on that, but that's a really interesting example, because inevitably we're running over time on our section. So I'm going to now swiftly move on to our next panel discussion, which will be with our technical partners, and I'll be introducing them as we go through. But first of all, I'm going to turn to Michael Dickman. Michael Dickman, as many of you will know if you've been on Res Forum Live before, is a professor at Cranfield University School of Management and has been responsible for some more research, including some research along with Ben Bader there, which has yet to be published. Perhaps you can give us a bit of an insight into what that's likely to be, Michael, as we move into the section now looking at our technical partners from here on.
Thank you, John, and hello, everyone. So the research is on responsible and sustainable global mobility. And so what it does is actually combines it with an element of what are we doing now in COVID-19 times, but also it has a bridge from the past where sustainability and responsibility topics were important to the future. The research report will develop an EVP, to take Bill Baker's point, of what the new employee value proposition can look like. But it starts off with basically arguing that now is the time to make GM more counting, more strategic, as David said earlier on. And it outlines also that responsibility and sustainability issues they are important now, they will even become more important in the future. So global mobility departments, when working with their vendors, 30% say now having a poor ethical approach, let's say, responsibility and sustainable approach, would mean they will drop their vendor. In 3 years' time, 70% imagine that they will do that as an organization. So there will be a huge shift. And the report ends with arguing, here are 10 action points, but briefly, they are: become more resilient, become more ethical, be attractive as an organization, be effective and forward-thinking by creating a new global mobility proposition, and lastly, be fair, meaning an international global fairness of local talent versus global talent.
Great, thank you, Michael. Let me just bring in our first panelist here in this particular panel with our technical partners, Alan Ferguson, Director of Employee Benefits at WBN Global. Alan, flexibility, and it seems to be one of the big things, technology and well-being, all of these sort of issues. What are you seeing? What are you sensing?
Well, I guess, John, our members advise on and guide companies to solutions on risk and insurance. Nobody saw this coming. The Global Economic Forum report, which they produced with Zurich in 2020, the top 5 risks were all environmental. Infectious disease has never made it into the top 5 over the last 13 years. So, nobody saw this coming, but, it was there all the time. Duty of care definitely has taken on a new meaning in the pandemic world, and will do after all this is over. I think that will focus a light on the carriers and the brokers and what information and how people get their information. And if you're not getting your information through your broker and carrier, you should be, because there is an awful lot there to be had. The latest RES research, the Now, Next and Beyond, I think that looks at technology and communication going hand in hand when it comes to the benefit side of things. A focal point for both general information, but also in translating this back to the benefits which employees would need to use. If you look at things like telemedicine, there's been an absolute explosion on that for obvious reasons, and there are wellbeing applications available now which are global applications, as well as EAP solutions which are global as well. So imagine that information all sitting centrally in one place from a communication perspective. On the new survey, which Benjamin mentioned, more than 2/3 of multinational companies see a high or extreme risk for ASIC mental health. We were talking 65% higher extreme worries about medical assistance and health standards, 86% high and extreme worried about family, 68% high in extreme feelings of loneliness and isolation. So the tech is there to deliver those well-being strategies. And I thought I'd just take from the end of that report, the Now, Next and Beyond, there are five steps. And I thought I would very, very quickly just relate those back to insurances. So number 1 is reconsider your future GM strategy. This will have an impact on the mix of people, the risks, and therefore the insurance needs of the organization. Don't miss this, because it will have an impact on that. Think digital. There are tools out there that exist within the plans that your organization already has, or in competitors that often come for free. Example is Enterprise Business Travel assistance application that we have that has global tracking facility for medical assistance, evacuation, crisis management. 3 is prepare an emergency plan with different scenarios. Working through these, relating back to the insurances and plans is essential to make sure that delivery is there on the back of the plan. Define business critical as the fourth in times of normality, not calamity. Brings me back to a John F. Kennedy quote that we use in insurance and all the time, which is, the time to repair the roof is when the sun is shining. Never a truer word is spoken. And rethink communication is number 5. Employee benefits have never just been about benefits. If employees aren't able to relate to these or use them in times of crisis, then it all falls down. Communication around the benefits, how they can be used, when they can be used in the context of a particular crisis is absolutely essential.
Great. Thanks, Alan. I'm going to wind you up there, but let me bring in Mark Costa Rising, who's Group Sales and Marketing Director at AGM, which is a Harmony relocation member. Mark, at the coalface there, what are you finding as far as practical implementation is concerned?
Hi, everyone. I think it's very difficult, and the market is changing rapidly, daily. We're listening to lots of government advice and how that's really leading mobility to make decisions. For us, as you quite rightly put it, at the coalface, we're spending a lot of time listening and then advising our clients. We're delivering services on the ground. Our main concentration in a very agile environment is to look at how can we deliver a surety to families on the move. Lots of people are very anxious. How can we adapt and use virtual tools, which in the past have been great enablers, but I think technology in how we communicate with families and mobility departments is going to become very much a driver going forward. So I think for us, delivering services around the world, we're restricted by governments and how certain countries are coming out of lockdown at various speeds with different restrictions around them. So for us at the coalface, we spend a lot of time really understanding where mobility are. I think there's a lot of confusion for mobility. For once, I listened to this call. I'm glad I'm on the service delivery end. I'm glad I'm moving the people. I think it's a torrid task that mobility have and trying to advise strategic advancements for the business. But our role is really to listen and understand and really advise and guide and then ultimately deliver safely, because we talk about duty of care. We're moving families, we're moving elderly employees, we're moving families with young children that may have sickness in the household, and we have to do that safely across the world. So we're spending a lot of time listening and understanding. We do risk assessments before every move we do to make sure before we enter either a home search or a removal situation, we're fully aware of what we're walking into, and also that the client and the family are fully prepared, so there's no surprises.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much. And let me bring in our final panelist on this panel, Paul Bailey. Paul Bailey is Manager Europe for Culture Wizard. This is an area I'm somewhat familiar with, cultural orientation. I'm assuming, of course, if no one's moving around, you don't need to give anybody cultural orientation at all, because they can all just sit at home and learn it with no problem at all. How's it going for you?
If only, John. Yeah, it's a really interesting time. I think that our role in terms of international signee management has been very much a sort of process-oriented role. It's been very much about inserting our services in a very specific way into the assignment process, and that's been about briefing the assignee and the family. I think now this becomes more of a holistic approach that we have to adopt. So in our business, we sort of interface with D&I, we interface with learning and development generally in a lot of different areas, such as leadership, inclusion, and in particular virtual teams. So what we've seen in the short term is, if you like, a bleed from the sort of traditional areas of intercultural briefing that we would normally provide to assignees through to things like virtual. So the idea there is that we give people the proper tools to manage a sort of a virtual interaction with their colleagues from whatever location they may be working from. So it has a sort of an added sort of element of complexity as some of your other contributors have mentioned, when you're talking about a virtual interaction across cultures. So that in particular has been a big deal. I think looking at from a wider context, I think that's going to be part of the sort of risk reward, if you like, of expat assignments going forward. So, a lot of people have talked about risk. I don't think we're going to immediate risk through delivering more cash to people through richer assignments and sort of going back to the future in that sense. I think what this has to be is more of a sort of an approach which is, as I mentioned earlier, a little bit more holistic and deals with the assignment from a whole career perspective. So, it simply takes probably what we're on a track of doing already and makes that much more sort of urgent in the sense of taking the assignment process and linking it into a whole career approach. And that encompasses talent, obviously, and a lot of other areas.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Sorry to cut you short. We are running inevitably very, very late, but we're now going to move towards our breakout sessions. Just before we go into that, we'll have another poll to try to bring you in, to try to let you participate a bit more. Now, this poll is looking at what we think the most important practical GM issue is for your organisation over the next 12 months. And we've given you a few choices there. I won't read them all out, but if you would like to have a look through them, including making flexible GM programs work, dealing with requests about flexibility, and so on. And a nice one at the bottom, other, which of course is something you can put in if you'd like to submit that now, and we'll put that through its process. And I'll tell you, we're about to go into our breakout sessions. They'll be rather short, and when we're in the breakout sessions, you will have a host, and one of the hosts from three people from Res Forum, Jose Sagada, Andy Piacentini, and David Schofield. And if you want to raise a question during the breakouts, just raise your hand, and that's probably the best way for you to be alerted. Here's the result of that poll, and as I can see, fairly equal, there are three at the top: making flexible GM programs work, dealing with requests around flexibility of location, but the highest by a small margin is concerns around compliance, tax, work permits, etc. So that's a bit of ammunition. Let's move now into our breakout sessions. This is where you can talk with a little bit more ease, although rather briefly, I'm afraid, because we're running behind time. So see you on the other side. I think most of us are coming back now from our breakout sessions. I hope it was useful for you all. And we might as well kick off with our roundup as people come back in. Hopefully people will be able to see it. And I can see immediately David Schofield, fortunately, there. David, you were one of the hosts of one of the breakout sessions. Perhaps you could give us a little wrap-up of what you discussed while you were away from the main forum here.
Sure. Well, thank you, John. We spent some time talking about flexibility, and won't go into specific details. Perhaps it wouldn't be quite fair of some of the companies that were raising this, but if I could share that we had some mixed approaches in that big multinational with people who had to have, if you like, boots on the ground in parts of the world, including countries like Malawi, Tanzania, difficult locations. To make those businesses operate efficiently, they've got to make sure that those boots are back on the ground if they're not on the ground. So they're adopting a policy which calls for people to, if you like, resume their assignments fairly promptly and not being given too much choice in that matter. That perhaps simplifies it, but it's a thrust to get people back to work. Other organisations, perhaps with smaller assignee populations, are able to be more to be more flexible and to allow people to work from home, but not necessarily from home, say if you're based in London, but it could be a third location if that works for the business. So interesting takes on flexibility. Some organizations saying, well, we need to get this business up and running and we need to have you in places X and Y, others more flexible. I'll pause there, John, and let my colleagues from other groups give some feedback. We said a lot more, but that's all I've got time for.
Okay, thank you, David. Well, let's bring in Jose. Jose, you were the one of the other hosts. What happened in your breakout session of note?
Thanks, John. Yeah, so had a really good conversation, I think, with a couple of the large multinationals that were just running through some of their kind of hot issues. I think a lot of it is around, probably quite a lot of pressure from HR and the business on some of the flexible working arrangements, and a feeling that sometimes mobility, because we covered it from let's call it a broader perspective, often we're seen as perhaps the bad guys in some respect. But I think, that's an important point. And one of the other external partners was saying that actually it's important not to rush into decisions around new policies and supporting the ways of working, which I think we all want to as much as we can with the right mindset, but actually it's taking a step back, reflecting what's right for the organisation, understanding the longer term implications. I think that was an interesting point that was made as well. One of the other kind of large multinationals was saying around it's probably a bit of surprise at the shift of global mobility and the role of global mobility over the last few weeks, but some real upside to getting a seat at the table and really providing a lot of strategic input and leadership. And it was a feeling that actually it's about staying at the table now, using this as an opportunity to continue to add lots and lots of useful value and input as we go through the processes.
Thank you very much, Jose. That's great. Andy, you were the final host there. Let me bring you in. What did you see of note in your breakout session?
So I'll keep it very brief. I mean, I think in our session, I guess I could summarise it by saying that people feel a bit kind of caught in the kind of firing line in terms of the problems that we're facing and solutionising around that. And by that we mean GM are often seen as people that can find creative solutions around the kind of the standard models, and yet with the sort of left and the right hand tied behind the back, be it if you're US based, the kind of Trump administration, and they're kind of make it up as you go along executive instructions, or the kind of restrictions implemented purely on the back of COVID, that ability to provide solutions is really limited, and yet more than ever, per Jose's point, GM are a go-to in terms of what is the answer. How do we move people? How do we use mobility to engage people that are stranded or people that can't engage with their teams because of remote working? So actually, it was quite a lot of kind of just sort of allowing kind of the people talking to kind of vent a bit and talk about the challenges. We didn't really come up with a lot of the solutions, but I think some of the solutions have probably been formulated through the other part of this discussion, and I hope that was useful. One thing that was suggested was I want to talk about how GM teams and what's the well-being of GM teams and wellness within it, because actually they're getting it from all angles at the moment, and their usual mechanism through which they achieve, I guess, delivery of business objectives is not achievable, and that in itself could be causing stress within teams. So sort of provocative question rather than having the answer, but something we should all watch out for.
Great, thanks, Andy. More questions, hopefully some answers as we go through, but we're moving on now to our final section, which is to realise, of course, that the new GM model is going to bring new risks, and how can those risks be mitigated and how can those risks be dealt with. And we're going to be turning here to Anvil, who, of course, well versed in this sort of thing, risk management and so on, and compliance and those sort of things. And Matthew Judge, I can see, and we're also expecting Matthew Judge is the managing director of Anvil Group, and we're expecting Nicola Elcock as well. Can't see her at the moment, Matthew, so I'm going to rely on you to kick off with this.
What I'm going to do is I'm not going to flick through a number of slides. We're just going to keep this infographic up on the screen, really, and I'll discuss certain points around it. So hopefully you are able to all see it. Essentially, it is a infographic referring to a 12-step process to return to international assignment or travel, as we framed it. And essentially, it's just a cue card, if you like, to from which people can consider key elements of things that they should think about and assess prior to assignments or trips actually starting, and some of the steps at the end there around what to do when the assignment or trip has already started. So I'll focus mainly on a few elements here at the front end, And it's been interesting listening to some of the breakout session results and the discussions so far, as we're going to, touch on a number of those points. So it's also, I need to caveat that this has been done on the basis of the fact that the organisation has actually decided to return to work or to return to travel in some way, shape or form. And this can be used as part of the process for enabling those assignments to resume, or for short-term assignments and trips to actually start. But it will formulate the due diligence process of which you as individuals can use to raise as discussion points across the wider community or stakeholder team that's involved in the process. But number one is assessing physical and mental health of the employees. So there's a great deal of focus around physical health, but one element that seems to be being forgotten about following the COVID situation is people's mental health and well-being. And organisations do need to take stock and understand the mental resilience and well-being resilience of individuals before they're actually put back out on assignment outside of their home country. If it's resuming an assignment and somewhere they're familiar with and been to before, then the anxieties and stresses perhaps might not be so great. But obviously, if it's a new assignment or a new requirement of a trip abroad, it still may cause some anxiety. But the main point I'm trying to make here is that prior to lockdown, people would have been aware of their own general physical health and well-being, but lockdown does very strange things to different people, and obviously we've all been on our own journey throughout this period and may have been exposed to other symptomatic issues that can occur, such as the bereavement of loved ones, close family, friends. We may have developed or re-experienced some symptomatic issues of prior mental health issues, should we have had them before, which can also cause issues. And of course, on the physical health side of things, we may have had existing medical conditions that unfortunately haven't been able to be treated correctly during lockdown, because the health services of our respective countries have been operating in the same way as they were prior to the lockdown, because they've been dealing with COVID. And that can fall all the way down to some of the lowest sort of common day-to-day issues, such as dental issues and things like that, that have been left untreated, which individuals now need to get dealt with. So assessing the resiliency of individuals to be able to go back onto assignment and business trips and short-term assignments, I think is a key element of assessing whether individuals are fit to go back to work, essentially. And I think going through some sort of assessment process with your occupational health teams and asking them to become involved prior to assignments taking place again, I think would be a fundamental part of your risk assessment before assuming and resuming travel. We all now know that illnesses caused within the workplace, or COVID illnesses now caught within the workplace, are issues that are reportable under the RIDOR legislative areas of the Health and Safety at Work Act within Europe, and there will be other labour legislation in other countries that will need to be considered. And therefore, from a duty of care and a risk management perspective, it will be very pertinent of organisations to take steps to ensure that they have this area covered and that they have tried to assess it in some way, shape or form before just automatically posting people back on assignments. You may also find as well, it becomes part of the immigration work permit or visa process as well, because where a number of work permits or visas were revoked as part of certain countries' lockdown procedures, therefore those visas and work permits will need to be reapplied for, and therefore health assessments as well as antibody testing and antigen testing for COVID will be part of those processes by those respective governments. I think the actual monitoring of quarantine controls in different jurisdictions is obviously going to be a big challenge, as they seem to be changing on a daily and hourly basis with certain countries. I think obviously in Europe we're now starting to hear more about the plans for opening up certain air corridors that are tested, which will allow us to start moving again more freely across Europe. Obviously, the EU has now brought out some governments and direction around that, whereas previously a lot of the individual European member states had obviously made up their own rules without consulting with the broader EU environment. And of course, I know as global mobility specialists, you're probably all worried about the posted workers directives, which are obviously now going to be a concern for individuals as they start to move through this period. So understanding the quarantine restrictions upon arrival in certain countries and which countries are available to travel and move back to are key. I think people will need to be aware that there will be quarantine controls when arriving in different countries, but it's also important to understand where that initial quarantine will need to take place. A lot of people are assuming that they'll be able to land in an aeroplane and travel freely back to the city where they were based before, or they're now going to be posted. But actually, a lot of the quarantine needs to take place in the city where the airport is located, for up to 14 days. So that means they will have to stay in temporary accommodation in the city where the airport they've landed in is based, and they need to be aware of what those quarantine controls are. We've heard of some clients that have experienced issues because employees have landed in certain countries. They're going to respect the quarantine control, but they thought they'd pop to a restaurant and get their favourite meal before going to their accommodation, taking a selfie and announcing to everybody on social media they're back, and that being picked up by the authorities, and therefore they've been imprisoned for 14 days or several weeks for being in breach of quarantine controls and restrictions. I think you also need to understand as well the requirements for the track and trace applications that different governments have also put into place for certain jurisdictions, and whether your IT security controls and cyber controls will allow some of those applications to be installed. Obviously, it will be imperative and necessary for assignments when they resume in certain countries to adapt to those controls and protocols, but you'll need to be sure that those applications can be downloaded and supported on company devices. And we are aware of issues, especially where people are traveling as a family, where perhaps the children haven't had it installed on their telephones before resuming going back to school, and therefore that's caused particular issues and legal challenges in those areas. So it is a moving feast, and it is something that can be monitored, though, some of these controls and challenges, and I'd encourage you to work with your third-party supplier base and your supply chain to understand who might be able to best assist you with maintaining and understanding those controls, because a number of the technical partners, including ourselves and others, have got mechanisms now for assisting you with that process. It's also worth pointing out that there has been changes now in insurance policies, mainly around things like traditional policies like business interruption insurance, but it does also impact elements like employers' liability insurance, where COVID as an issue has been part of insurance or covered as in a communicable disease in previous policies. New policies aren't tending to cover that, and and therefore you would need to be aware of any changes in those insurance policies that may impact you. Luckily, I don't believe most private medical insurance has changed since COVID, and therefore that coverage does maintain. And we have heard of additional insurance policies being launched to provide additional benefits and cover specifically for COVID-related illnesses. But it will be something your assignees will be concerned about should they return to their assignment destinations. What if I was to contract COVID at a later stage, and how will that impact me, and how will the organisation be able to assist me during this time? And all of that leads into conducting risk assessments on the destination countries and cities to be visited. A lot of people tend to look at these risk assessments as on a country as a whole, but it does need to come down to individual cities of location sometimes, because different cities, even for example across China, will have different controls in place. And we've even seen in the UK that we're getting these lockdown bubbles starting to appear, and most recently that's occurred in Leicester. But we already now see that London is looking at how the implications of the city lockdown in Leicester is going to impact the controls and the processes and the procedures for how London would react, and what information data sources from which public authorities they will need to levy and understand to trigger those processes. So I think what we're also saying there is a risk within countries from simply travelling from one city to another domestically, and therefore that should be understood if there are additional requirements and any additional testing that may be undertaken at those particular stages. I believe we've probably be aware from the press releases that one of the airlines out in Dubai was even imposing their own tests at people at the airport before they were able to get onto the plane. Unfortunately, they were the finger prick style tests, which have since proven to be wholly unreliable. But nonetheless, it's something that people need to be aware of as part of the journey of returning on their assignment, or when they're on assignment and moving around these countries that they may be exposed to. So I think I heard somebody mention earlier as part of the discussion that this is also an ideal time to learn from some of the previous lessons that we may have experienced when moving into lockdown about the repatriation and the communications that need to take place with our assignees and employees at different times. And it's an ideal time now to really look at your medical emergency response plans for receiving treatment in particular countries, because the health landscape has changed, and some of those facilities that we were able to access before may no longer be available to treat families in those particular locations, or they may be still operating on a reduced range of services, and therefore not all situations or medical issues will be able to be treated. So I think that the main area there is about re-looking at your business continuity plans, looking at your evacuation planning and engaging with the security teams of your organisations or the risk teams to understand what could be put into place and done differently, because I think we've all experienced trying to repatriate individuals from those countries at this during that particular time was incredibly difficult. The cost of charter aircraft went through the roof. The route options weren't available and open to us in the same way before. And one of the main suggestions I would make is look to establish evacuation points within the same country to secure safety where possible and avoid those particular situations.
Okay.
But the main message is it's not just a problem for mobility. It is a wider organisational issue, and it's a great opportunity for the mobility teams to now have a stronger voice and lead the charge in bringing a lot of these disparate stakeholders together to ensure that you all have a proper plan so that you can re-engage with assignments and travel properly and effectively without causing anxiety and fear to the employee base.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Matthew. What a great presentation. And it brings us, I'm afraid, towards the end of the programme. And we've just got time to do a bit of a wrap up. And for that, I'm going to bring in Michael Dickman again, Professor Michael Dickman from the Cranfield School of Management. And we heard from you earlier on. You've been listening intently, no doubt, to everything that's been said. Just give us your main takeaways from what we've heard throughout this last 75 minutes.
Thank you, John. A very, very broad and inspiring discussion. 5 main takeaways: flexibility in a very volatile, uncertain world. Every speaker spoke about flexibility. So it's a question of what in different areas. Technology. So how do we use it? How can it inspire us to track and be more operationally agile and yet compliant? Third, technology and duty of care. So we can go for global well-being solutions, but we can also use technology as a backpack, as an office. So the beautiful motorbike photo. It struck with me the new forms of global work, so hybrid working that might come in, and we mix more of the traditional assignment versions. There is the last point about operations in a COVID world, 12 steps to return. But really, overall, one key bit is also the strategic and operational role. So now in Unilever, we suddenly are in a much more strategic role. How can we maintain that? And how can we expand it, as David Rooney said, into an international cross-border advisory?
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Michael. Now, finally, the one person we can't have Res Forum Live without, of course, is David Enser, Managing Partner of Res Forum, who undoubtedly has something to say, looking back over the last 75 minutes.
I do. Thank you very much. I'll try to keep it brief in the interest of time. First of all, Matthew, thank you for the very interesting slot. You know, what I've heard again and again and again, putting myself in the shoes of a global mobility professional, we heard it from Jose, we heard it from Andy in the breakouts, is the pressure that you guys are under in in-house HR roles to effectively meet the wishes and meet the needs of senior business leaders. And I think what we saw there from Matt is a brilliant cheat sheet, a brilliant guide, a simple step process to the kind of topics that will help us fight the fights that we get involved in at the moment. So that for me really jumped out. I think another thing that came out is, of course, you know, lots of staff have been furloughed. I'm sure that applies to global mobility teams as well. So beginning to think how you digitally enable your program and make sure that there is a proper digital backbone to everything that we do, so that when the work returns, we're working in the most efficient way that we possibly can. And I think for me, digital is at the core of that. Communication again and again and again comes out as a topic where organizations see themselves lacking, and there's significant room for improvement. And perhaps my last challenge is as well, I noticed one very tactical and operational thing. We talk in Matthew's first box about visas, checking your visas. And of course, I think the concept of doing a stock take of your immigration scenarios is critically important. But as was raised to me yesterday on a call with a head of GM for a major international bank, what happens when all the immigration offices, even if they've reopened, they're dealing with a 3 or 4 month backlog. So it's these kind of operational challenges that I guess GM will continue to face. I wish you all the very best for those challenges over the course of the next few weeks until we talk again. Back to you, John.
Thank you, David. And so we're very nearly out of time, but it just leaves me to say and add to the enormous thank you to everyone who has participated in this edition of Res Forum Live. Thank you for your insights and practical advice on how to implement global mobility policies in these extraordinary times. Once again, please leave us with your feedback on how we can improve Res Forum Live. Let us know what sort of topics you'd like to hear about. Indeed, let us know if you'd like to take part in the panel discussions, and you will see an email address on the screen in just a few seconds' time. But for now, it's goodbye from me, and as always, stay safe.